okay, I verified who you are, now I can start to make changes for you. That really wasn't our process so much. Like, that was one of the things that we would do, but in the moment of a disaster, you have to kind of like find other ways to respond and try to figure out, you know, how you're going to get back to normal. So I could have and should have by our processes, you know, not really helped the guy at all, because he couldn't, even though I could talk to him on the phone, it was our process that we had to get email to verify what changes in writing that we were going to make. And he made a very convincing argument why he couldn't deliver on that requirement. So, you know, as a human, as you're responding to it, that's my thing, is like approach it as a human. And then, you know, keep in contact and communicate. So that's pretty much my talk. I really didn't expect to talk this long at all. But if you guys have any questions, please just call me.
It's a great talk, by the way. The recording. So are you going to make the recording available?
Yeah, it will probably be on my YouTube channel.
Awesome.
Yeah, if you just.
So what my question is that I've heard people say how when you plan your disaster recovery, you have to use, you know, objects stored, all this kind of stuff to make sure that no matter what happens, you've got several sites backing up your data. But what I heard from you is actually very practical and sensible. Is, well, you prioritize what's important and you plan for the surprise rather than counting on the big solution. Is that kind of what you were saying?
Yeah, I really think it's the difference between incident response and sort of disaster recovery. Incident response is things that you know are going to happen once a month, once a year. You know, there's going to be a fiber cut. There's going to be a routing problem, you know, with one of your ISPs. You know, there's going to be maintenance where your site's not going to be reachable because of something that the data center's doing. And what I like to think of as disaster recovery is like all of these things that you're doing, there were options, there were decisions not made. And simply, the simple thing for me is just to go back to what was your suboptimal choice? Why did you not choose it? And if the argument is, well, they violate PCI compliance because none of their stuff is encrypted, okay, that's not really a choice. But, you know, you have probably vetted it already, because the tendency when something happens is just to pull every lever, update every firmware, you know, change every firewall rule, and document nothing. That's the default plan. Without something else, that is what people do, and I call it making spaghetti of their network. Is it previously when we brought into situations, they had already made all of these choices. And then I would hit them back. I'm like, okay, well, your cluster doesn't work anymore. Let's just go to one machine. Just remove the load balancer that is in front of it, and prove to me that you can. I will block everybody else. Prove to me that you can serve me a web page. Let's reduce it to that, and then maybe we'll find the problem about why the cluster doesn't work. But you know, just because you always run on a cluster doesn't mean that in this time, you know, problem, that's the answer. And it's always the short answer. The short time frame answer is usually the better answer. Yes.
Question: how often do you recommend reviewing and testing your disaster recovery plan?
At least once a year.
Okay.
Because you're running your incident response every day, and that plan is sort of going to, you know, amorphously just sort of work and appear. But for, you know, disasters usually don't happen to you. Statistically, you're not that likely to happen. I happened to work in a company where everybody that came to me considered it a disaster. So disaster just sort of became incident response from my point of view. And that's sort of it, is like, you know, it depends to like how big of the problem is it. And you should constantly be, you know, every 4 or 5 years you're reviewing your contracts about whether you use this service or that service. And it's those sort of things are like, you've already done the research, you already have most of the data, just take those things and say, well, choice B now becomes plan B.
Sure. My question was essentially not just you specifically, but like your team, your
Yeah.
the thinkers.
Yeah, the easy thing is just to do a walkthrough. It's almost like playing Dungeons and Dragons is how I think of it. It's just think of a problem and then bring the people around the table and then throw little scenarios at them and say like, you're the decision maker, you're the person who, for this problem, blah, 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 and guess what? You're on a plane for the next 2 hours.
Yeah.
So you can't talk and tell everybody else what to do. Now, what does everybody else think we should do for the next 2 hours of our exercise? Yes?
How do you differentiate between the incident management and problem management and disaster recovery?
I think the incident commander is sort of controlling the conversation that's going on in the group. And mostly what's happened to me is mostly some vice president will come into the conference call, into the group, and will say, okay, explain to me why we need to do this. Okay, and some network engineer that's on the call or some application guy will reiterate what he has already told the rest of us, what has already been, recommended up, and then somebody else will come down and say, okay, we'll use Azure or for this or whatever the choice is. But usually the incident commander, I see it as gathering all the options, right? And if the normal options fit with the normal flow of business, okay, that's what we're going to do. Pull those backups out of that, long-term storage from a month ago, and we'll use those. That's not normally what we do, but just it becomes anything that's just out of the normal flow. Is that's why you want to have a consensus. You want to have everybody's opinion. You want to have their objections, and you want to concisely present that to the vice president so that he can tell PR why we're doing this. And because mostly when I've had those conversations, the vice president just says, okay, let's do it. Because you've vetted out the dumb responses by having a team that kind of puts it together. If it's just one person makes dumb decisions. The 5 or 6 people don't make dumb decisions. 12 and 20 people don't make decisions.
So the dumb decision happens by default.
Yeah, exactly. And just for me as an engineer, when I'm making those big, firewall changes or big network changes, I always go to a channel and I tell somebody else what I'm going to do. It's like, hey, I'm about to run this command. Does this make sense? And sometimes just by putting it in a channel and then rereading it sort of is it. And so I'm all for working as a team and working with people with varying skill and sort of having that young guy who kind of questions the old guy. Why do you do this? Why do you run that? Why do you do it this way? It not only helps the new guy, but it sort of just spreads the information around from the network guy to the systems guy, and he's like, oh, I understand why the app does it because he's sort of telling him, and I'm just observing. That's a lot of just how I like it to work.
Yeah, for the disaster recovery planning, what I have learned, I think the 3 things most important is to identify what are the critical system or the critical piece of the business process that we need to recover. That's it, number 1. Number 2 is finding out where's the data. Because your backup data should not be on the shelf. Because if the building is not accessible, you don't have backup data. The backup data needs to be somewhere. And number 3, you need to have a recovery site. And sometimes the hot sites are expensive for a smaller company, but you can work out with other companies, say reciprocal. If my company is down, I need to use your server, and then if your company is down or your company system is down, you can use my server. So disaster, sometimes like here in Los Angeles, we earthquake. So I don't want to set up somewhere in Irvine or in Santa Monica. I want to maybe somewhere in Arizona or maybe even in Seattle. So something to think about. The 3 things is important. Is what is the critical system or critical systems that must be up in within a day or 2 days or 3 days. And then where's the backup data? And where's my recovery cycle? The rest is what he said makes sense. It's very good.
I would actually add to the most critical systems that dependencies are very important too. People often overlook the fact that, for example, if DNS is down, all other systems are going to be unreachable or down. So having this also knowledge of all the dependencies, such that the critical systems are up and running is very important.
So that's why the backup data should have a full backup data. They're also backing up all the systems, including the operating systems and everything.
Yeah, but doesn't that have problems because of the complexity of it? If you're in recovery, you've got to be able to recover the data you need. And if you've got terabytes, petabytes of data that you've backed up, how are you going to decide that?
That's why you have disaster recovery testing. You tested what you need, what you need to back up your critical system.
I tell you, in a mainframe environment, which I grew up in, you've got 100 tapes and you're trying to recover your backup. It's going to take you a week to find your data.
But then again, that's exactly why you need to find out what is your critical system or critical systems and how you back up the system.
Well, that's why I went,
Yeah,
like,
you
whatever the
test
option
it.
is,
You
is to put a
test
time
it.
frame on it.
Yeah.
And say,
Test
okay,
every
you
year.
can take a week.
Prioritize it.
Yeah,
So that's-
exactly.
By the time frame.
Yeah.
What I've been through is, everybody remembers Sandy, the Hurricane Sandy in New York. So we had a disaster recovery plan and we had an offsite data center. And one thing we did that was really effective is, I think once a year we would fail over entirely the area, disaster recovery. And we said, oh, this doesn't work, okay, we need to fix that. So that would be really effective.
Yeah, it's hard to do a whole disaster recovery, but you can totally do pieces of it.
Yeah.
And put that together as your plan. And the tabletop walkthrough is kind of like to get all the internal departments like on board, but then to actually do it, kind of puts it in people's faces. It is like, look, you are critical to this, and everybody's going to expect that you can do this, so let's do it beforehand just to make sure it works.
Also, to your point about a select few to be the real people dealing with this, we did that, and we had about 12 people. At each sister site, we had about 12 backup laptops ready with FedEx, and they came in handy.
Exactly. Just and then there were laptops. They were mobile. They were easy to move around.
Yeah.
That's
Just a question about cloud services. How do you impact it? How you go about doing this, and what sort of impact that there?
What services?
Cloud services.
For the most part, it does it for you. Like AWS is going to do your backups and all that stuff. And the idea of a power outage doesn't sort of make so much sense because of their redundancy. But they'd easily have a routing problem. Like not just one fiber cut's not going to be a problem, but there could be an exploit, a worm inside AWS that just takes it down. So my argument would be is usually my response is, why not both? It's like, well, we're using the cloud. We're like, which cloud? So then your plan B should be the other cloud. And if that's your plan B, sort of, like, well, you're not going to run 100 servers there, but you should probably run 2, 3. You should be familiar with the processes of how their firewalls are a little different than the others and stuff like that. But I think just virtual systems are too ubiquitous, and it becomes too much of a central point of the problem to run a dedicated server just for a disaster recovery situation. It doesn't become economically feasible because of the ability just to spin up 100 new servers really quickly on somebody.
So is it sort of like a default solution to look at first?
Yes, absolutely. Because it requires no upfront cost. You can be like, well, our compute time is going to cost us 3 times more in a disaster, but the disaster in financial terms is going to happen once every 5 years. So you can put a number on things if you need to, and make arguments of like, well, this is, as I see it, is simply a choice. Now let's look at what if we just did everything dedicated. What if we go out and rent, space and just have the server sitting there 24/7 for 4.5 years and figure out that number, and then say, okay, what is the threat that you're defending against, sort of, the internal leakage of metadata or traffic.
Oh, I just was gonna reiterate, somebody said, actually testing plan, I worked in radio for many years, and what we would do a lot of times is pull the power main, just shut off power, and we would have to figure out if our systems work and we stay on the air, and we even have to be able to take our main site down and have a backup way of keeping the station on, because for, those little emergency things you hear on the air, you're responsible via the FCC to be able to stay on the air. You have to do it. And I think working in radio actually taught me some stuff over the years, because you would regularly test everything, your generators, UPSs, and all your backups you would test on everything.
When I lived in Florida, I lived through a couple hurricanes, and radio becomes your only means of getting information. Should I go north? Should I go south? Should I stay here? Is there
Public safety.
Is there a food pickup spot where I can get items? What hospital and stuff is
We
open?
still have an emergency broadcast system.
Yeah, and just the little simplest things in a disaster become huge. Just an hourly update over the radio kind of like regulates the new situation that you're in.
That's funny, Sasha doesn't look like the chaos monkey.
I wanted to make a, I'm sorry, go ahead. I was just saying, that building on that, and we haven't talked about this in the last couple of comments, that a big element of a disaster situation is the impairment of people. that laptop, that DR site is of no value if you don't have a person there with the skills to bring it online. And LA in particular, if LA gets impaired in a disaster, we should expect all the people in LA will also be impaired because they're worried about their family, not worried about the data center or whatever. And so then the question becomes, okay, our DR site in Colorado is great. Do we have a person in Colorado who can actually bring that site up and switch over to it? Exactly, it's backup people. And at an executive level, this may involve hiring a person who is underutilized normally, but they're a $100,000 a year insurance plan, so that you can bring your tech back up, because that's an element of disaster is the people will be impaired. If you have a disaster where your people are not impaired, you should consider yourself fortunate.
And that's exactly where the business continuity planning coming in.
Yes.
We're including that. And some companies, they do have offices like us, offices in other city, like the Washington DC. Then that office will become the hub site. That the employee of that company will become the people they will need to bring everything up.
But don't you have sometimes an issue where in companies, when really unexpected happen? I really like the point you made earlier about being ready for really the unexpected. I was at one site, and 2 squirrels, black squirrels, managed to jump over the power lines, and our substation came out of the ground 10 feet and had a huge explosion. And guess what? We all had backup generators, but not for the lights. So we had this huge, highly secure campus where we had no lights.
And that's sort of the thing of like
No
walking
amount of
through.
disaster planning will work unless you continuously find ways to assess it and I was about to say to attack it, but to assess it and think of the weird stuff that just come out of left field that you can't even, you've got to be prepared for that.
See, disaster recovery planning, the key is in the word planning. And testing the plan. That's why the auditors are always there when they do disaster recovery testing. Auditors is always there.
I think I wanted to make a point that Ken made earlier, when we talked about disaster ERP and IRP and the relationship between them. And I work for a pretty large enterprise company, and I can tell you that the IRP and the ERP are absolutely related to each other. Because there are situations, pretty rare, where an IRP situation will lead to ERP implementation. We've had failures of complete storage failures. What do? You've got a complete storage failure in a data center. What are you gonna do? That's no different than a disaster. Whether all the systems are up or not, it's irrelevant, right? So you have a mainframe, which is not, it's a very expensive piece of equipment. So most large enterprises have large expensive pieces of equipment. And the recovery for those pieces of equipment, there's a cost. There's a cost to recover it, there's a cost to fail over, and a cost to fail back. And so the analysis always goes to say, when you're doing the analysis and you're talking about the engineers talking about, hey, is this gonna be more expensive to restore service, or is this gonna be easier to do disaster recovery? You have to, it can start this way or it can go the other direction. It could be disaster recovery plan that creates an incident, say, hey, we think some major failure in the area has caused a big problem, let's create an incident. It might not be that big of a deal, or it could be an incident that goes the other way around. And we've had recoveries of mainframes which basically you had to fail over the whole, it was easier to just fail over the data center than to try to figure out how to recover a storage failure that's considered massive, right? And that has nothing to do with disaster, no squirrels, no nothing, just bad tech, okay? Old tech.
Are you talking about an operator that moves a damaged, just removable drive disk from one machine to another until there's nothing running anymore?
Right. But it's as I said, it's in general disaster. But the one thing you brought up, which is also very interesting, is the conversation on the phone calls. We have problems where we have so many people on the phone call, nobody could dial in anymore. Yeah. It gets to the point where you're number 25, at least you can still dial in. And number 30, the system just collapses, right? So obviously, we shield, a lot of the technical conversations are absolutely shielded like 3 levels from administration and management. They're not even in the same playing field. Meaning that there's definitely a segregated group for doing technical, and the disaster recovery planning, that's very well spelled out. You don't have managers, anybody who doesn't understand tech is not in that call. And that's usually what you were explaining, which I think is a very good point.
Yeah, and when you need to, and you know, when PR needs to come in and be like, we're going to do what? Okay, I've got to go sell that. Tell me again the technicals of why this or why not this, you know? And like my thing is all about communication. Is what it all comes down to, and it's easier to communicate to 4 or 5 people. It's not easy to communicate to 20. You know, especially when everybody's trying to come back. And honestly, what phone call have you ever been on where if there are 20 people on, you couldn't cut 5 off? what phone call have you not been on where 3 or 4 people drop off randomly and you didn't know they're not there anymore? Okay, so if it's got to that level, and that's my reasoning, and I really just like started to get to so many incidents where you know everybody just wants to come in and listen. You just want to be updated on but just coming in and off becomes a problem. And you know that's my thing. I just like working with small groups because I want information from them.
And now the corollary to that is that now that you have the cloud, disaster recovery planning is much harder because now you've got 3 vendors plus yourself plus your own team. They're all in the same call, so you're gonna have 12 people no matter how you slice and dice the problem, right? And then you have to do with the 3 vendors. You got the Amazon guys.
4 vendors.
4 vendors. Yeah.
You forgot the guys that supplies the pipe.
So my general rule is I want 2 people from every department I got to work with. I want 2 sysadmins there. I want 2 network engineers there because I want them to be able to both hear it and both kind of wait. I thought you said we were going to do this, and they have their little 30-second, 45-second. I'm like, well, we can't because of, and then we're going to, and then we'll have to. And they're like, okay, now we know. And having 2 people there that have their conversation, is their sort of conversation, it's their mini group. And if I can get them in, then they can communicate back out to all of network engineering globally about what Singapore's going to do.
That's a good idea.
All right, great. Thank you, everyone. I think this is great. That was a really good topic. I think this worked out. I think we ended up having an even longer discussion than we usually do because I think there's a lot to say on this topic. I think this is a good starting point.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Please feel free to stay and network and make friends. Also, those of you who have volunteered during the summit last May and you have not received